All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Devin Bernofsky. Thanks for joining the Catchpoint NS1 joint webinar on DNS performance issues in China. We're pretty well equipped to help address some of these issues, both on the content delivery and monitoring side. We help enterprises all of the time sort of address some of these challenges. To briefly touch on exactly what we'll be talking about today. Oops, there we go. Just quick note on the agenda, lay the foundation here. Talk about the internet in China, some of the performance challenges and strategies that enterprises should consider. Briefly mention some of the advanced DNS strategies, talk about deploying inside China, and pros and cons, and some of the challenges you'll face, and then we'll discuss Nameserver acceleration, open the floor up to some Q&A. Just briefly introduce myself. I'm Devin Bernofsky. I'm the lead solutions engineer at NS1. NS1 is an authoritative DNS provider, the huge emphasis on traffic management. And then I'll go ahead and let Mehdi introduce himself, and he's gonna kind of take things from here for the first part of the presentation. So Mehdi.
Cool, thank you so much, Devin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Excellent, thank you. So my name is Mehdi. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Catchpoint. I love DNS. I love the challenges that China brings to the table, and we're hopefully going to have a great conversation around how do we make sure that your digital experiences are near perfect in that huge country with an incredible market. So the first thing we're going to go over is obviously just some high-level overview about China. But before that, why do we even care? Why should you even care? We know that the world we live in today is a digital first, and so the user experience is literally the product. You can have the best product in the planet. If you have a hard time delivering it, it's going to start collecting dust. So whether it's digital SaaS experiences, if you're in the SaaS business, or you're using SaaS products like Office 365, etc. Obviously, the media experiences, so that's around not only delivering your content, but the ads and the monetization around the media is extremely important. And obviously, e-commerce. And e-commerce these days has a lot of facets. It's an omni-channel environment where the experience goes from the store to return to the website, etc. So it's really about the user experience, and we cannot ignore the user experience of a billion people. So just to put things in perspective, China is not only physically a huge country, but 22% of all the global users are there. And this is growing. 300 million people shop online, and they spent about $400 billion last year. This is expected to reach $1 trillion by next year. So we're talking about big numbers, and obviously makes things a little bit harder, obviously. So the internet in China, it's for many of us, it's usually a black box. But what you have to know, just because I think both NS1 and Catchpoint have had extensive experiences in China, there are really three main providers. That's the way the internet is built there. So you have China Telecom, China Unicom, and China Mobile. These are the big ISPs, and really Telecom and Unicom are really the dominant ones. The network is congested. Just think about the number of users online. You can just think about why this is congested. We all know a little bit about the Chinese firewall, which is a system or a set of systems that are here to protect the country from content that is deemed objectionable by the host country. The firewall act in different ways. There is filtering based on keywords. There is deep scanning. There is packet monitoring. It's a very sophisticated tool that has been evolving over the past few years. you really have, somebody told me once, you have to think about China not as one country when it comes to the internet, but multiple countries, and regions are very autonomous from each other, even from an internet perspective. Because of the congestion, obviously packet loss and latency become an incredible problem to deal with, especially when you think about the protocol as sensitive as UDP for DNS. You know, somebody said this is where I will give you the joke about UDP, but you won't get it, right? Packet loss. Maybe a few geeks in the room will get that. So this is the internet in China. So the biggest thing to take away is you have to really think about it as a separate country or set of countries within one country. I'm having some. So one of the biggest mistakes is thinking that you can deploy or you can serve the same content to your users in China like any other place in the world. And so not taking into consideration the latency, the packet loss, and most importantly, the fact that if you do not have a website that is optimized for China, you're going to have problems. So what do we mean by optimized? So we know that in China, you have certain keywords and certain sites that are blocked. So most social networks or foreign social networks are blocked. Most ad serving technologies are blocked. A lot of things are blocked. So when you just take your website that works great in the US or works great in Europe and say, okay, this is going to work great in China, that's mistake number one. So if you do not remove the content that is causing the firewall to get triggered, what's going to happen is the users are going to have a horrible user experience, because if you have a Facebook tag on that page and that tag is now blocking, well, the whole web page is going to block. So obviously the question is like, do I go and deploy in China? It's not as easy as said. Obviously, you have to get a license. You have to get what is called an ICP license. It's fairly easy. It's just some paperwork and some bureaucracy, but not in a negative way, obviously, that you need to follow, but it's doable. So what did we do on behalf of our customers? We have deployed about 55 monitoring stations. We call them nodes in China. They're mostly in the most populous regions, and they're connected to the key carriers within those cities. Again, in some cities, it doesn't make sense to have Unicom or Telecom or China Mobile. So we try to make sure that we have the right carriers in those cities. We also have a last mile set of nodes, and also we just launched a few months ago wireless capabilities in Beijing, and we are exploring other areas such as Shanghai and other cities. I love to use this example because this just shows you the complexity of delivering a great user experience in China. I've used this slide over and over again. I just keep updating it with the latest Lambo. So this particular one has a mere price tag of $4.5 million. It can go 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds. So it's a monster, right? Beautiful monster. The mechanics are incredible. However, how fast does the website load from China? Well, it used to be okay, like sub 20 seconds. However, in May, they've added a lot of content to their site, especially some social network content that is causing the website to go really slow. And so, as you can see, the web page now loads in about 30 seconds. The availability dropped to about 50. We have a hard, although it's configurable, we have a hard limit in Catchpoint for a web page to load under 30 seconds. Again, it's customizable, but because of that 30-second threshold, the availability dropped. And you can see that the main reason, or the jump in performance, is if you look on the right, there is a chart with the number of hosts. The number of hosts went from 8 to 16, and those hosts, some of them are blocked in China. And so it's mostly social networks. So this is a film strip. We tested this also from the last mile in both Beijing and Shanghai on the same network, so Telecom and Unicom, etc. And literally the page loaded in 29 seconds with a lot of failures, either failed requests or things that are being blocked. So again, not the fastest website from China. So I did this little analogy. In the 30 seconds it took to load the site, that particular car that can go 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds would have traveled half a mile, just to put things in perspective. So that little turtle. So I've been a big proponent of DNS at Catchpoint because I really believe that when we talk about this digital user experience, and it's all about that, and the customer experience makes the product, etc. Well, that first impression starts with DNS, really, right? So the first thing that the user, that customer is going to have, that interaction with your brand, is through the DNS lookup. Nothing happens before that, is looking up www.abc.com. And so what we did here is we took about 22 CDNs, content distribution networks, and we looked at them from China. Their names are obfuscated because this is not, this is to give you an example. And literally we looked at the DNS time it takes to resolve those particular domains. And the ones at the top, the three top ones, are local CDN vendors, CDN companies. And everything else is, you know, CDNs that have presence a little bit in China, but the DNS needs to go outside of China. And some of them are just not doing a great job at all. When you takes, you know, almost 2.6 seconds to load a 10 kilobyte image, and just doing 2.6 seconds for the DNS lookup is not great. So first impression is critical, and that first impression starts with DNS. This is another example. So we looked at two companies. One is BMW and one is Patek Philippe, a watchmaker. And this is, again, just the DNS lookup over the past 6 months. And you can see that there is definitely a major difference between those two companies. And the difference is BMW has a Chinese strategy, in my opinion, because they have done everything possible to serve most of their content out of China, from China. And Patek Philippe, in this case, for DNS, they rely on a European DNS vendor that does not have a presence within China. And so you can see clearly the difference. It's 3 times slower. And this is even amplified even further when you have very short TTLs. When you have a time to live of 30 seconds or less, you know, the consistent DNS lookup doesn't get any better. Another mistake that people make, unfortunately, is thinking that, well, I'm just going to put some stuff in Hong Kong, or I'm going to use a vendor that is in Hong Kong. Yeah, it's part of China. However, the firewall is still in between Hong Kong and China physically. So this is a difference, and we're showing you data about Catchpoint itself. So the picture at the bottom left shows how long it took to connect from our nodes to our command and control system, to the one that we have in Hong Kong, which is in green, and the one in blue is our command and control in Beijing. And this is used to control our nodes and manage them, etc. And so the metric I'm using here is the TCP connect time, how long it takes to establish a TCP handshake. And you can clearly see the variability by hour, and the x-axis is the time, local time in China. And you can see that, you know, at 10 a.m. things get really slow. At night, things get very slow. And so you have to take into consideration that Hong Kong, although it's from a latency perspective, from a distance perspective, it will help a little bit latency. It's not a bulletproof solution. And so thank you, Devin. The other thing here on the graph at the bottom shows you the standard deviation time. The one on the right shows you the average time. So what you have to to understand is how big that standard deviation is during those hours when you're connecting to outside of from China to the outside. So very quickly, what do we do on the DNS side at Catchpoint? Besides capturing the DNS metric from all kind of other tests we do, whether it's web test and API test, etc., we have two capabilities that are unique in the sense that are specifically designed to capture and measure the actual DNS infrastructure. We have what we call a DNS experience, which basically can use either TCP or UDP. Can capture some extra data if you do NS bind or NSID or bind. We can capture the host name that served that content. And DNS experience, think about it as doing a dig, no trace, no rec, to be able to do the full DNS lookup and go step by step each step of the DNS resolution. The DNS direct one is used to be able to pinpoint one of our nodes to a particular DNS server, whether it's a public name server or your own, and say, hey, what's the answer for this particular domain? And you can request, obviously, a record, text records, etc. So thank you. Devin, yours.
Thank you, Mehdi. Yeah, we use Catchpoint monitoring all the time on our own infrastructure, both experience and direct tests. We'll see some of the instant tests that I ran just to kind of demonstrate some of the stuff we're working on at the end of my part of the presentation here, so we can look forward to that. But let's kind of hop into some of the bits that I wanted to talk about. There might be a bit of overlap here, but obviously, you know, the difference between our vantage point as a DNS offering and the monitoring applications, we might have a bit of a different outlook on this stuff. So we'll kind of cover the Great Firewall from a high level. I think Mehdi did a great job describing this stuff. Obviously, there's incentive for them to put in place some filters. They're inspecting and filtering certain content. Mehdi mentions, you know, some of the social stuff. At a high level, a lot of the ways that they've attempted to censor different things at a basic level start with IP filtering, and this has probably been in place for the longest. They'll look at specific IPs and just block them outright, and that's relatively easy to do. And then we start with getting more complex with things like DNS tampering and hijacking. There are complex DNS poisoning mechanisms in place with this different recursive resolvers, and they're actually doing things like deep packet inspection, looking for specific keywords. So there's, you know, a lot of incentive to kind of keep tabs on exactly what content you're going to be delivering, and understanding exactly what the Chinese government and different entities are looking for and blocking can be incredibly advantageous. Mehdi also mentions, you know, some of the internal peering issues. Chinese network is pretty fragmented. It's run by largely, you know, 3 telecom providers: Unicom, Telecom, and China Mobile. And there's far less peering points, and premium peering is quite expensive in China. We find that, you know, that's maybe anywhere from 600 to 800% more expensive than the rest of the world. And there's also a lack of anycasting, or it's incredibly cost prohibitive to do. BGP is tough out there. So that makes, you know, especially for an anycast DNS provider, very difficult to add points of presence in China. We do have a point of presence in Hong Kong, but, you know, starting to talk about infrastructure in Beijing and Qingdao, all of that really has to be unicast. And we've come up with some creative ways to sort of bypass this. We'll talk about Nameserver acceleration in a bit. That's a sort of a tricky way that we've been able to incorporate unicast pops into our anycast topology, but that can wait until the end here. A couple other things, just briefly touch on. If you are using lots of quad A records, IPv6 is largely unsupported in the region. It just doesn't appear to be a priority for the country. And then DNSSEC. So DNSSEC, as many of you might be aware, is essentially designed to allow for a chain of trust to be established from, you know, the root name servers to the TLD name servers to all the way down to the authoritative name server. And it's designed to prevent things like cache poisoning. So some people have figured out essentially that if you spam a recursive resolver with packets that have maybe malicious IP addresses for maybe google.com, for instance, occasionally you can actually have that submitted into the recursive resolver's cache, and then users that query that resolver are going to send to a malicious website. We hear a lot about this. You'll hear, domain hijacking. There's a lot of this going on with like cryptocurrency right now, and actually like Route 53's BGP announcements were hijacked a few weeks ago, and they set up some essentially malicious resolvers in order to steal Ethereum from cryptocurrency wallets. And that all could have been prevented had a chain of trust been sort of built out using DNSSEC. The problem in China is that this is not supported. It kind of, we see adoption being maybe around 1%, and that's largely because of all of this DNS hampering that we see being done by the Chinese firewall and different actors in that region. So if you do have poisoning issues inside of China, there's some things you can do, but DNSSEC isn't really an effective technology in that landscape. So let's talk about addressing some of these challenges, some of the peering and deployment challenges that you might face if you are looking to deploy infrastructure behind the firewall and really enhance user performance and experience. And I kind of boiled it down to the 4 talking points here. Obviously, working with local service providers can be incredibly valuable. And that's something that we've learned in deploying our own network inside the mainland. It helps to have boots on the ground. It helps to have, be working with individuals, companies that have relationships with all of the large ISPs and service providers there. So that can be incredibly valuable, and that's something we would recommend, just, essentially building partnerships that will sort of guide you through that process. And then, as Mehdi mentioned, the ICP license is pretty critical if you're going to be delivering content in China. And that's a relatively straightforward process, so long as you're willing to abide by their rules. And this also goes hand in hand with working with those service providers that we talked about. They can kind of, guide you through the process, and it's all relatively straightforward if you are working with the right folks. The next thing I'll talk about is building applications to withstand bandwidth saturation. So obviously with, the firewall being what it is, and there are moments and hours where it gets a little hot, and we've seen, using Catchpoint's technology, that occasionally, it's going to take a long time for a connection to be established to, points of presence outside of the firewall. And so building services and applications that are designed to operate, on their own without any interaction with the outside world can be incredibly valuable. So that for us means building our name servers to not have to talk to anyone outside of the firewall. They can serve things from, a local Mongo and Redis cache, for instance. And if they lose connectivity, obviously we're not going to be able to push changes to these name servers, but they'll be able to serve the records and answers that they need to for all of the users that are inside of China. And then last but not least, I'll talk about implementing orchestration tools. So a lot of the times you are going to obviously want to be placing nodes that are inside of China, but might not need to be accessed by users outside of the firewall. And so DNS can be an incredibly powerful tool here. Being able to deliver content to users who are querying domains in a local fashion, whether that's based on geography or ISP, it really is going to enhance your users' performance. So, if you do have, a large CDN for your global audience and a few Chinese CDNs for inside the country, DNS could be a good way to achieve sort of split horizon. So make sure that that's in place before you start exploring these options. Or maybe if you just want to go with a China-specific CDN, and we'll talk about this a bit, partition your domains into .cn and .com. That's not necessarily a requirement, but it can be an effective way of addressing these challenges. So let's talk about our managed network really fast. We had a lot of customers, obviously, with very large global footprints, and they're looking to move into China. And there's obviously, a huge opportunity. We talked about the 22% of global internet users that are actually living inside of China right now. So we went ahead and built a unicast network inside of China. There's presence in Shanghai, Beijing, Qingdao, and Shenzhen. And then along with a point of presence in obviously in Singapore and Hong Kong, so pretty close there. And this has allowed us to deliver exceptional performance for enterprises that have partitioned their users into a .cn or .com. And this is also what we built Nameserver acceleration technology on top of. So the performance has been exceptional. And again, we talk a bit about sort of the orchestration layer. Really important to be able to sort of divvy up traffic depending on where the request is coming from. So that means many of you may be familiar with our filter chain technology. That's our sort of rule set that allows for different traffic management policies. And it's also important to note this isn't built on top of bind, so that allows us a lot of flexibility. You also get a really robust API and integrations with services like Catchpoint. So you want to take advantage of Catchpoint's really robust monitoring infrastructure inside of China. And when Catchpoint recognizes maybe an endpoint has gone down, we can go ahead and change our routing policies automatically, fail over to different CDNs, different endpoints. If you do have multiple CDNs in China, we can actually make a performance decision based on real user metrics. So taking latency measurements from internet browsers using JavaScript and then making a performance decision. So this is great for, localized service outages. It's a pretty big country. And what's also great about this is there's unified management. So if you are using our global anycasted network, this is a single pane of glass. It's a flip of a switch that we'll show off later. You go ahead and just enable the Chinese network and all of your records are pushed to that network. And then performance. So we're getting typically sub 50 millisecond response times inside of China. We can kind of take a look here. We've been doing some monitoring using Catchpoint from a variety of different regions. These are all global backbone, but we do have some last mile stuff available as well. Incredibly high availability too. If you are reaching outside of the firewall, occasionally you'll have issues. As Mehdi mentioned, UDP is a relatively lossy protocol. There's no really, if you're dealing with packet loss, it can be kind of tricky. So keeping all of your responses inside the firewall can be incredibly advantageous for a lot of reasons. Now, I mentioned we did have a pop outside of China inside Hong Kong. So for DNS responses, this is kind of what we get for the China network versus the global network. So you can see a lot of benefits here. And obviously a huge benefit is also the availability here. So, keeping those requests inside China for users, especially on the last mile, can be incredibly advantageous. So limitations, what I'm going to describe here is just, if you do decide to partition traffic by .cn and .com, so you have, a China-specific set of name servers for your .cn domain, and you don't expect global users to be accessing those resources, that's great. But if you do have a global .com domain that you want to be serving to everyone, essentially, using China-specific name servers is going to really degrade performance for global users. Even if recursive resolvers are performing the more performant name servers, that's just a sort of a tricky equation. So with the China network exclusively, really good for .cn domains, but wouldn't necessarily recommend enabling that for .coms. But that kind of brings me to Nameserver acceleration. And Nameserver acceleration is essentially our way of bypassing the inability of content providers to anycast within China. And the way this works is actually pretty cool. Before that, I'll kind of talk about the performance here. Obviously, I talked about this. If you want to be accelerating .com domains and you want to make sure that everyone everywhere is getting the best possible performance, Nameserver acceleration is kind of what makes sense. So there's no need to set up specific domains for separate delegations. You don't have to have a .cn and a .com and manage those separately. You can kind of aggregate everything all under one domain. And what we're able to do is intelligently select which network a user is getting answered by using a filter chain that's at the NS record level. So it's a step above where it would normally go. And I pulled this from our patent application here. This is kind of a high level how it works. We've got a user on the left here, and he's going to query, for example.com. And this is a record that we have Nameserver acceleration applied to. So the DNS resolver is going to go through a whole host of different lookups, starting with the root name servers and the TLD. And then the TLD is going to pass the query along to essentially at dns3.go1.ns1global.org right now. And we've applied a traffic management policy to this particular record. Normally that would be a static glue answer, But we're actually able to return either our unicast China infrastructure or our global anycast infrastructure, depending on where the request is coming from. And that answer gets cached for a few days, and then any query that comes to this DNS resolver for this specific record is going to get passed to China network for China users and our global anycast network for anywhere else, maybe Europe or North America. So to kind of simplify this here, we've got our Nameserver records, and if you're inside China, you're going to see this is our China network, and if you're outside of China, you're going to see our managed anycast network. So it's pretty powerful stuff. I've got a few more sort of visualizations here. If you do partition your traffic into .cns, anyone inside China is going to get a really excellent user experience, but users outside of China, maybe coming from Europe, are going to get a really poor user experience. Conversely, the same could be said for if you have, a .com with a global anycast network associated with it. Users inside of China are going to have a suboptimal user experience because those queries have to actually traverse outside of the firewall to places like Hong Kong, whereas European users are going to be just fine. So the intent for Nameserver acceleration was to get the best of both worlds, essentially. Optimal user experience for both users inside of China and outside of China. They're going to be delivered to China and global infrastructure, respectively. So to kind of show this off in action, I did want to use some of Catchpoint's instant tests. For those of you that aren't familiar, Catchpoint offers the ability to run instant tests anywhere in the world, and we find ourselves using this all the time, especially because a lot of our traffic management policies are pretty diverse and robust. We can serve different answers to different places. And so for troubleshooting and just demonstration purposes, it's incredibly valuable. In this case, what I've done is essentially queried our Nameserver acceleration pool for an answer. And I've queried that from two places, Beijing and San Francisco, on AliCloud and Comcast, respectively. And what we're hoping to demonstrate here is the two different networks that can get answered depending on where you're making the request. In this case, we've got 47.94 being responded in China. And then outside of China, we're getting our global anycast network here. So just to sort of iterate exactly what's going on here. And again, this happens sort of a layer above where we would normally be performing maybe traffic management rule sets. So pretty unique. I thought it was a cool technology. And then just to really quickly highlight how easy it is to sort of enable China Nameserver acceleration technology or the managed China network. If you do go into your portal and create a zone, in this case, I've got Bernosky.cn, it's a pretty straightforward checkbox. So you're going to go ahead and just turn on China. We'll go ahead and push all the records that are associated with that domain to that independent infrastructure, and then you'll delegate to new name servers depending on what you want to have set in place. If this is a .cn, you'll delegate to the China-specific name servers and vice versa. Great. Well, I think, Mehdi, at this point, I'll hand it back to you to kind of conclude here.
Thank you. So what we want to obviously leave some room for questions, but these are some of the useful monitoring tips and things to keep in mind for China. So it's really about making sure that you measure, because obviously if you don't measure, you can't fix. If you don't measure, you don't know. So ultimately, Beijing is really this hub and spoke kind of architecture in China. So if things are not working in Beijing, a lot of things won't work anywhere else. So making sure that that at least you ensure that everything is working from Beijing. Remember that there are really three carriers: Unicom, Telecom, and Mobile. So China Unicom is the north, Beijing and up. China Telecom is Shanghai and south. And then China Mobile is a little bit everywhere, but still very limited in comparison. So measure locally, the old adage, think globally, act locally. You can think globally, but you really have to measure locally. We're in the telemetry business. I haven't met any SRE team or DevOps team or Ops team that doesn't like metrics, but it's really important to measure locally. So within the firewall, measuring from Hong Kong or from a cloud provider is not really going to give you that level of visibility. You have to take into consideration the different layers, whether it's the application or the service, in this case DNS, or the network. So making sure that you have enough statistical data points that can basically tell you how you're doing. And it's also good to all benchmark against your competitors as well. So that way you can see, it's like, is it just happening to me or to others? If you are trying to measure the impact of DNS, one thing to do is test, do an HTTP request to an IP address versus an HTTP request to a host name with a DNS lookup in it. Look at content reliability. What I mean by that is, Devin talked a little bit about some hijacking and things like that, and I've been involved on so many conference calls with customers where literally their URLs have been hijacked. You make an HTTP request to an object that would go to a CDN, and then in the response back, some carriers will hijack that and redirect it to a local CDN company. So we've seen some really weird stuff. So make sure that you look at your content, do integrity testing, make sure that you call an image or something, and then that's the right file that is being sent. So what you do when things are slow, how many of us have received one of those emails? Hey, it's slow, it's down. So before you blame anything, just make sure that you have all the right telemetry coming in. Is it DNS? Is it ISPs? Is it happening everywhere? Is it local, micro local, etc.? So these again are some of the tips that you can check. I won't go through all of them, but this presentation will be available later on, so you can build your own checklist or playbook if you want. So again, these are some of the other things. So we've compiled a list of solutions that we've heard over the years since we've been dealing with our infrastructure in China and our customers there. Doing a dig, doing pings, using a tool like Catchpoint, obviously. Are things working in China? Another check to do is like, hey, China versus Hong Kong, for example, just to rule out the firewall. So there are a lot of different things. Again, the IP versus domain can be interesting. Doing HTTPS versus non-HTTPS to see if we've seen. I had this customer that had a JavaScript that was being delivered, and the HTTPS version would work, the HTTP version wouldn't work, because in that JavaScript there was the word Facebook. And so as soon as they were able to see that, they blocked that request, and when the HTTPS request would happen, it would fly. So these are just things that we've learned over time. Here, the only thing I would really highlight is, and I see this a lot, is really manage and maximize your time to live. If you have an A record with the TTL of 30 seconds and you don't have a plan B, then why create this extra strain on your systems and potentially extra latency on the end users? You can increase that to 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be 30 seconds, especially if you don't have a plan B. I've seen customers or domains that have a TTL of 10 seconds and it's the same IP address that gets returned over and over again. So those are kind of things, that low-hanging fruits that can not only improve your response time, your user experience, and reduce the traffic to your DNS servers or DNS provider. So when you're doing monitoring, obviously it's continuous monitoring, 24/7, 365 days a year. So making sure that you collect all kind of metrics, whether it's DNS, connect, first byte, wait time, etc. Make sure that you capture the response codes that are sent back from the HTTP servers. That makes troubleshooting so much easier. And then try to capture screenshots if your monitoring tools are capable of taking screenshots. Do it, because we've seen where failures were happening, but not at the HTTP level, not at the code level. So we'll get 200, but the content was literally not the content that you were supposed to receive. So make sure that you have the alerting set up on the file size or an MD5 checksum, etc. But capture the screenshots, because if somebody is hijacking your content, your URL, you want to visually prove that there is a content issue. So last one to recap the top mistakes. Hong Kong is not China. Japan is not China. DNS is important. That's literally the first customer experience you have. Deal with the, have different websites. You must have a different version of your site for China. You cannot have a web page with Facebook on it and expect for it to work. Even if I have abc.com and just a URL, in the URL name, there is image.facebook.jpg, it will get blocked from China. And it will get flagged. And then once the firewall gets triggered, they will start learning more and start blocking more your site. So you have to remember that this is not a dumb firewall. It's actually fairly smart. Make sure that the origin is not too far from the edges. Obviously, you've heard this before. Another trick that I've seen work extremely well, and this was given to me by someone at Google many years ago, is now it's, everything is SSL. But if you're not serving your content via SSL in China, you should, because that will reduce the amount of potentially things being blocked. So these are just some of the tips and tricks. Hopefully some of them will work. And if you have others, share it with us, please, so we can keep making the delivering experiences better for everyone. So at this point, we'll take some questions.
Great, thanks, Mehdi. So let's go ahead and just cover a few of these guys. First and foremost, Mehdi, this might be a good one for you. What's the best resource for learning about banned URLs and other hosts that will get blocked by the firewall?
So there is actually a great website called The Great Firewall. I forgot the URL. Let me look it up. That basically has a list of all the domains that are blocked. Wikipedia has also some interesting information there. Just go on Google and search for Firewall of China, Great Firewall of China. There are a bunch of resources, but there is a site that has the list of all the domains. I'll make sure to add that to the presentation before we share it with everyone.
Awesome. So maybe this is a good one for me. Can I set up redundancies for my DNS, CDN, et cetera, in China like I do in other parts of the world? Yes, the answer is yes, absolutely. Probably not a bad idea, to be honest. And DNS is a great place to sort of orchestrate those redundancies. You can have multiple endpoints, multiple CDNs that are available, and we can actually use DNS to make availability and performance-based decisions, sending users to the most performant endpoints, the most performant CDNs in specific geographies, using our Pulsar product, or even just active failover, understanding when things aren't responding in a way that they should, using a system like Catchpoint, and then making record level changes. So we talked about TTLs a bit. Obviously having a sort of happy medium, depending on what your use case is. If you do have lots of redundancies and you want to be nimble when changes are made, it can be helpful to have low TTLs or maybe lower than average. If you're not employing any of those strategies, a higher one is definitely going to be beneficial. So yeah, that's certainly possible. Let's talk about this one actually a bit. Is it possible to get the necessary licenses without an experience or without an office in China? Mehdi, what's your experience been like there?
It's hit or miss. It's a great question. So there are a lot of very good companies that can help you navigate that. Most cloud providers in China, whether it's Microsoft, Google, not Google, sorry, Microsoft, AliCloud, Tencent, can help you navigate that, and they can facilitate the introduction to people that can get you there. So we just went through it through the help of one of these companies I mentioned, and it has been pretty good. It was done in a few months without any hiccup. It used to be much harder. I think it has gotten a lot easier.
Excellent. Yeah, that's been our experience as well. We don't have boots on the ground in China, but obviously working with cloud providers or another organization can kind of get you through those challenges in
Right.
relatively straightforward fashion.
I mean,
Um,
sorry to add one more here, Devon, on this
Please.
topic. The big Chinese companies are also present now in the US, which wasn't the case many years ago. So Ali Cloud is here, Tencent is in the US, China Telecom is in the US. They have an office, I believe, both East Coast and West Coast. So there are a lot more resources available to everyone to take advantage of. And again, it's not a black box, it's not the mystery box anymore. Things are very clear, and China is obviously very interested in making things easier for international companies to do business in China. So
Excellent. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, cool. So last question I think that we have here, talking a bit about expense. Is digital expansion into China more expensive than expanding into other countries? I talked a bit about this, mentioned a few quotes on like the order of 6 to 8 times more expensive for peering arrangements. What's your experience been like, Mehdi? I know you guys have obviously an order of magnitude larger, I guess, points of presence in China. What does that look like?
so it's a significant footprint from a physical perspective, servers, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that obviously the bigger your commitments, the better things are in general. But we find China to be fairly competitive than the other places around the world, whether it's Europe or North America. Not as much South America. South America still remains, I believe, one of the most expensive places to do business from a technology perspective and infrastructure perspective. I think if you want to do some advanced things in China, it can be expensive. Obviously, we talked about BGP. We're trying to get IPv6 in China. This is something that an order of magnitude like 3x or 4x what we currently do on IPv4. So we're trying to work with our providers there. So some of the new stuff can get a little bit on the expensive side, but I would say that in general, if you compare on average our cost around the world, China has not been prohibitive.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mehdi. I think that pretty much does it for the questions. Anything else that you wanted to cover before we let people hop off here?
No, I think, don't be afraid. Measure, make sure that you have the right telemetry, make sure that you have the right security mindset as well when it comes to China. I think performance and security get combined easier in China, just to make sure that you're looking at your content and you're protecting it, and that you're not getting hijacked, whether it's a DNS hijack or URL rewrites, etc. So keep an eye on those things, but it's not a market to ignore.
Wonderful. Yeah, all good advice. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I think that pretty much wraps up the presentation here. We'll follow up with some additional resources after the fact. And yeah, we'll catch you next time. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mehdi. Take care.